Welcome back, grade 10s. Now let us look at our first concept, which is the differences between formal and informal sectors. There's a note there. It says, remember that the differences between the formal and informal sectors need to be clearly stated. So we want the differences, we do not want the similarities, because even the two does not have similarities. So you need to state clearly the difference between the two sectors. Formal sector income is regular, weekly or monthly earnings. Under the informal sector, income and is irregular and inconsistent. So in the formal sector, you receive your income, be it on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis, but it is guaranteed that as an employee, you are going to get that particular income. When we come to the informal sector, here income is not regular than the formal sector rather. The income is inconsistent. You would get this amount of money this month, next month you get this another amount of money. Hence, in the beginning, we said that people who are working under the formal sector, they are protected by certain legislation, which I mentioned before, your basic conditions of employment, your Labor Relations Act. So in this instance, the income is not regular. Why? Because business is not consistent. Sometimes business is making money, sometimes it's not making money, and it's not registered, so you've got nowhere to complain. But with the formal sector, it's registered and employees are protected by law. So that's why they are getting their income on a regular basis, which it can be weekly or it can also be monthly basis. Employees work specific working hours under the formal sector. Then under the informal sector, employees work long hours. So in terms of the working hours, under the formal sector, employees work specific hours. Why are they working specific hours? Because it is stipulated on the BCEA the number of hours that have to be worked by employees. So businesses under the formal sector, they are guided by legislation. Whatever they do, it has to do with the laws that are put in place by the government that those businesses have to follow since they are registered. But when it comes to the informal sector, they work long hours. Why? Because the business is not registered, there's no legislation that is guiding informal sectors. Hence, workers, they are working long hours rather than working the normal hours that they should be working. So in short, I can say that workers are exploited in the informal sector. Then under formal sector, businesses pay tax to SARS on turnover and profits made. Under the informal sector, businesses, they do not pay tax on the profits of the business. So under the formal sector, since it's registered with the CIPC, registered with SARS, on whatever profits that they make, they need to ensure that they pay tax. Those businesses are taxed. When it comes to informal sector, businesses under informal sector, they are not taxed because they are not registered with South African Revenue Services. Now let's move on to our second concept of the lesson, which is the meaning of the public and private sector. We'll start with the public sector. So there's a tip there. The public sector provides services to the public, and the aim of the private sector is to make a profit. So here's a tip. A public sector, it offers services to the public. So not to say specifically their main aim is to make a profit rather than a private sector. The private sector is there to make profit. That's their aim. Then the public sector comprises of various business enterprises owned and managed by the government. So the businesses that we find in a public sector, these businesses are owned, they are controlled by the government himself. It is composed of all levels of government and government-controlled enterprises, also known as state-owned companies or enterprises, which is SOCs or SOEs. So all the businesses that we find here under the public sector, they are controlled, they are managed by the government. Hence, we call them the state-owned enterprises or the state-owned entities. So obviously, in this public sector, the government is the majority shareholder. Hence, he is able to control these businesses that fall under the public sector. refers to businesses that are owned and controlled by the government. For here are the examples of public sector businesses. We have our Eskom. Our Eskom is owned by the government. It's a state-owned entity. We have Denel, we have SABC, we have South African Airways, we have your Transnet. So these, before we move on, these are some of the examples of the businesses that are owned by the government. So they are controlled by the government rather than individuals themselves. So those are the businesses that we find in the public sector. Government is the controller in these businesses. Then moving along to the private sector. The private sector consists of business activities that is owned, financed and ran by private individuals. So in the private sector, here there are businesses that are owned and controlled by private individuals, not the government himself, but private individuals. Businesses in the private sector are privately owned by sole traders, partnerships, close corporations, or profit companies. Their main aim is to make a profit. So the businesses that you find here under the private sector, these businesses are owned by private individuals. It can be a sole trader, it can be partnerships, it can be close corporations or profit companies. These individuals started these businesses with the main aim of making a profit, selling or rendering services, selling a product or rendering a service to the consumers with the aim of getting a profit in return. So the government is not part of these businesses. They are solely owned by private individuals. Some of these businesses exist in the formal or informal sectors. So some of the businesses that you find in the private sector, they form part of our formal and informal sectors, whereby you find in the informal sector, you would find your sole traders. Even in the private sector, you would find your sole trader. Hence, they are saying it exists in the formal, be it they are registered or not registered, but they are owned by private individuals and not the government himself. Then let's look at the examples of private sector. Private sector business. We have banks. Banks are privately owned. We have our hotels. Hotels are privately owned. They are not owned by the government. We have our insurance companies. They are privately owned as well. We have our restaurants. They are privately owned by certain individuals and not the government himself. So he does not have control over these businesses. And we also have our retailers. So learners, you need to understand that private sectors are owned by individuals and not the government. The government does not have control over these businesses. The government has only the control on public sector businesses, which are state-owned enterprises or state-owned companies. Let us just go for a quick ad break and I will see you shortly.